In Adanna's village, the story of the river god had been told for generations. Every few decades, the river chose a bride, and the chosen girl would disappear beneath its waters, never to be seen again. It was a fate spoken of in whispers, with fear and reverence. The elders said the river god was powerful, a being who controlled the currents, the rains, and the life that flowed from the river. No one knew what happened to the brides, but it was always said that they never returned. Some believed they lived in a beautiful kingdom beneath the water, while others feared that the river god's love was possessive, trapping them in his world forever. Adanna had heard the stories her whole life, but she never thought the river would choose her. It was the dry season when the river began to speak. Adanna was fetching water from the riverbank when she felt it. A strange tug, a soft whisper on the wind. The water rippled at her feet, though the day was calm and still. Her heart pounded in her chest. She dropped the pot she had been carrying and stumbled back. The village elders had told the young women to watch for the signs. The river would ripple, the air would thicken with the scent of rain, and the chosen one would feel the call deep in her bones. Adanna stood frozen. The whisper grew louder in her mind. It wasn't words exactly, but a feeling, a pull she couldn't ignore. The river has chosen, a voice spoke behind her. She turned to see the elder, his face solemn, his eyes filled with pity. The villagers had gathered now, watching from a distance. Fear and sorrow filled the air. The river had chosen Adanna. The next day, the village gathered to send Adanna off. She stood at the river's edge, surrounded by her family, friends, and the entire village. Her mother's hands trembled as she placed a cloth over Adanna's shoulders, whispering prayers for protection. "You will be remembered," her mother said, her voice breaking, "even if you never return." Adanna's heart ached. She had always known this could happen, but the reality of leaving her family, her home, her life, it weighed heavy on her soul. Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced them back. The river was calling, and she couldn't refuse. The village drummers played a soft rhythm, a sound of farewell. Adanna took one last look at her family, the thatched huts, the fields she had known her whole life. Then, with trembling hands, she stepped towards the water. As she neared the river's edge, the water rippled again, and the pool became stronger. Adanna's feet felt heavy, as if the very ground was urging her forward. The air around her grew thick, and the scent of rain filled her lungs. Her heart raced, and she looked back one last time at the village. "Adanna," the river whispered in her mind, the voice soft and warm, like a lullaby. She stepped into the water, and as the coolness touched her skin, she felt the pull become physical. It wasn't frightening. It was gentle, like invisible hands guiding her into the depths. She gasped as her body moved forward, sinking into the river's embrace. But instead of cold water filling her lungs, she felt warmth, a strange, comforting warmth that wrapped around her like a blanket. Adanna closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she was no longer in the river. Adanna stood in a world she had never imagined. She was no longer in the familiar river that had provided her village with life. Instead, she was in a grand, shimmering palace beneath the water. The walls glittered like fish scales, glowing softly in the dim light of the water dot. The air was thick with magic, and the sound of the river's flow was everywhere, humming in the background like a song only she could hear. She looked down at herself. She was dry, though she had been submerged moments ago. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her fear was slowly replaced by wonder. "What is this place?" she whispered to herself. The palace stretched out before her, vast and intricate, with corridors that seemed to lead in every direction. Spirits, both beautiful and terrifying, drifted through the halls, their eyes sharp and unreadable. They whispered as they passed, their voices carrying secrets Adanna couldn't understand. Adanna wandered through the palace in awe. Every surface shimmered, reflecting the light of the water that surrounded the palace. The spirits paid her no mind, continuing their whispering and floating through the grand halls. The further she walked, the more she realized that the palace was endless, as if it was a world unto itself. Suddenly she heard a voice, deep, commanding, and ancient. "You are mine now," it said, soft but powerful. Adanna turned to see him, the river god. He stood tall and majestic, his skin as dark as midnight, his eyes glowing with ancient knowledge. His presence was overwhelming, filling the space around them. He moved toward her with a calmness that made the river ripple around him. "You belong to me," the river god said. His voice flowed like the river itself, soothing yet full of power. Adanna stared at him, her heart pounding. This was the being she had heard stories of all her life, the one who controlled the river, the rains, and the life that flowed from the water. I don't understand," Adanna stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "You are my bride," the river god said, his gaze never leaving hers. "You will remain by my side here, in my kingdom forever." His words sent a shiver down her spine. Bride, forever. Adanna's mind raced. She had always known this could be her fate, but standing here, facing the reality of it, was something else entirely. The river god's eyes softened as he looked at her, but there was something possessive in his gaze, something that made her heart race with both fear and curiosity. Days passed in the palace, though time felt different here, as if it flowed with the river itself. Adanna stayed mostly in silence, observing the spirits and the shimmering halls. One day, while she sat in a quiet corner of the palace, a spirit approached her. It was smaller than the others, with a soft glow, and it hovered in front of her. "You are not like the other brides," it whispered. "The river god has given you gifts." "Gifts?" Adanna asked, her voice hesitant. The spirit nodded and floated closer. "Try to call the rain." Adanna looked confused. She had heard stories of the river god's brides, but never that they had powers. Slowly she lifted her hand, feeling the air around her. She closed her eyes and whispered, as if speaking to the river itself. A moment later, a soft drizzle of water fell around her, not from the sky, but from the very air itself. The rain was gentle, nourishing, and Adanna felt a surge of power course through her veins. As Adanna grew accustomed to the strange powers she now held, the spirits watched her closely. Some were curious, others wary, and a few whispered warnings that made her heart race. "Be careful," one spirit said, as it floated by her one day. "His love is like the river's current. Once it pulls you in, it's hard to escape." Adanna felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen how the river god watched her, his gaze always filled with a possessive intensity. She was his bride, yes, but the weight of that title seemed heavier with each passing day. Despite the river god's kindness, there was a coldness to him, a distance that made Adanna feel like she was always being watched, controlled. "You belong to him now," another spirit whispered. "Forever." One evening, as Adanna wandered the halls of the palace, she came across a quiet pool, its surface still and reflective. Something about it called to her, and as she stepped closer, she saw something that made her heart ache. Through the surface of the water, she saw a vision of her village, her family, the people she had left behind. Tears welled in her eyes as she knelt by the pool, her fingers brushing the surface. She had missed them so much, and seeing them now, living their lives without her, made her chest tighten. "Do you miss them?" The voice startled her. Adanna turned to see a spirit, glowing softly as it hovered above the pool. "I do," Adanna whispered, her voice trembling. "But I can never go back." The spirit smiled, its eyes gleaming. "Are you so sure?" The next day, Adanna was summoned to the grand hall where the river god sat on his throne. The court of the river god was vast, with spirits of all kinds floating and whispering in the dim light of the water. Adanna walked through the grand hall, feeling their eyes on her. The river god sat at the far end, his presence commanding the room. His dark skin glowed faintly in the light, and his eyes were fixed on her as she approached. "You summoned me," Adanna said, softly standing before him. The river god nodded. "You have seen the world above." Adanna's heart skipped a beat. How did he know? I did," she admitted, her voice shaking. "But I didn't." "You belong here," the river god interrupted, his voice firm. "Do not forget that." Adanna lowered her gaze, feeling the weight of his words. She belonged to him, and there was no escape. That night, Adanna lay in her chambers, staring at the shimmering walls around her. The river god had given her a place in his palace, a life of comfort and power. But her heart ached for the world above. As she drifted off to sleep, she felt a presence in the room. She opened her eyes to see the river god standing by her bed, his expression unreadable. "I will always be with you, Adanna," he whispered, his voice like the flow of water, "even in your dreams." Adanna's heart raced as his hand gently brushed her cheek. His touch was cool like the river's current, but there was warmth in his eyes. "Do you love me?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. The river god's gaze softened, and for a moment the possessiveness in his eyes faded. "I do," he said, his voice low and filled with something deeper than power. "But my love is not like yours." Adanna didn't know what to say. She had felt his affection, his desire to keep her by his side. But love? She wasn't sure what love meant in this world. Over time, Adanna began to understand the spirit's language. It was not words, but feelings, emotions, and whispers that flowed like water. She would spend hours walking through the halls, listening to their whispers, trying to make sense of their warnings and secrets. One day, as she sat by the pool, a spirit approached her, its eyes glowing softly. "You have power," it whispered. "But power comes with a price." Adanna looked up at the spirit, confused. "What price?" The spirit didn't answer. It simply drifted away, leaving Adanna with a sense of unease. One evening, as Adanna and the river god sat together in the grand hall, she felt a strange tension in the air. The river god had been distant lately, his gaze more intense than usual. "Do you love me?" she asked again, her voice trembling. The river god's eyes darkened for a moment before softening. He reached out and took her hand, his touch cool and firm. "I love you, Adanna," he said, his voice soft but powerful. "But my love is not the same as yours. My love is the river's current, strong and unyielding. It will never let you go." Adanna felt a chill run down her spine. She had wanted to hear those words, but now that she wasn't sure how to feel. Despite the possessiveness of the river god's love, there were moments when Adanna felt a deep connection to him. One night, as they sat together by the quiet pool, he told her stories of the river, of the world beneath the water, and the spirits that lived in it. Adanna listened, fascinated by his tales. She realized that the river god had seen and known so much, far more than she could ever understand. His love was ancient, rooted in the very waters that gave life to her village. In those moments, Adanna felt closer to him, as if they were two souls bound by the river's flow. Even as Adanna spent her days in the shimmering palace, mastering her powers and learning more about the spirits, her nights were filled with dreams of the surface. She would dream of her mother's warm embrace, of the fields where she had once worked, and of the village bustling with life. One night, her dream took her to the village again. She saw her family sitting outside their home, their faces etched with worry. Her mother's eyes were red, her father silent. Adanna wanted to reach out to them, to tell them she was alive. But in the dream, she couldn't move. She was trapped, as if invisible hands held her back. When she woke, the river god was beside her, his gaze soft but intense. "You are mine, Adanna," he whispered, his voice like the current of the river. "You must forget the world above." But how could she forget? The village, her family, they were still in her heart, even as she remained beneath the river. As the days went on, Adanna found herself wandering the palace more often, trying to escape the thoughts of home. One day, as she walked through a hidden corridor, she encountered a spirit unlike any she had seen before. It was darker, its form more solid, and its eyes gleamed with mischief. "You miss your home, don't you?" the spirit whispered, circling around her. Adanna stepped back, wary of its presence. "I do, but there's no way back." The spirit's smile widened. "There is always a way back. The river god may have claimed you, but he does not control everything." Adanna frowned, unsure of what the spirit meant. Could it be true? Was there a way to return to her village? "Be careful, Adanna," the spirit continued, its voice dripping with temptation. "The river god's love is possessive, but perhaps you could escape." Despite the whispers of temptation, Adanna found herself growing stronger with each passing day. The river god had given her powers she never thought possible. She could command the rain with a mere whisper, bring life to barren lands, and even communicate with the creatures of the deep. The spirits obeyed her, and even the water itself seemed to listen to her commands. But with this power came a sense of responsibility. Adanna knew that she could use her gifts to help her village, to bring rain to their dry fields and prosperity to their crops. But the question remained, would the river god allow her to return? One day, the river god took Adanna on a walk through his kingdom. The world beneath the river was vast, much larger than she had imagined. They passed through glittering grottos, where schools of fish darted through the water, and grand halls where spirits danced and sang in celebration of the river god's power. As they walked, the river god spoke of his love for the water, how it had given him life, and how he had become one with it over centuries. "You are part of this now," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "The river flows through you, just as it flows through me." Adanna felt a strange sense of belonging, but also a weight. Could she truly live here forever, away from the world she had known? One evening, as they sat together in the grand hall, Adanna voiced the question that had been on her mind for so long. "If I were to return to my village, would you let me go?" The river god's expression darkened, and the water around them rippled with his mood. "You are mine, Adanna," he said, his voice low and filled with power. "You belong to me and to the river. If you leave, you will never be free of me." Adanna's heart raced. She had feared this answer, but hearing it made it real. Even if she returned to her village, she would always be bound to the river god. But could she live with that bond? Could she live between two worlds? Days turned into weeks, and Adanna's longing for her village grew stronger. She had grown accustomed to life beneath the river, but her heart ached for her family, her friends, and the life she had left behind. Even the power she had gained didn't fill the void. One evening, as she sat by the quiet pool in the palace, she saw a vision of her village once again. This time, it was different. The fields were dry, the crops withering under the harsh sun. Her family looked tired, worn from the struggle of trying to survive without her. Tears filled Adanna's eyes. She had the power to help them, to bring rain to their fields, but she was trapped beneath the river, bound by the river god's love. That night, Adanna confronted the river god. "Why must I stay here forever?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "I have power now, power that can help my village, my family. Why won't you let me go?" The river god's eyes darkened, and for a moment Adanna thought he would refuse to answer. But then he spoke, his voice soft but firm. Because you are mine, he said, his gaze locking with hers. The river has claimed you, and so have I. You cannot leave. Adanna's heart ached. She loved the river god in her own way, but his love was suffocating, possessive. She couldn't live like this, trapped between two worlds. As the days passed, the river god's jealousy grew. He could see the longing in Adanna's eyes, the way she stared at the pool and watched her village. He knew that her heart still belonged to the world above, and it angered him. You think of them too often, he said one evening, his voice low and dangerous. You belong here, Adanna, not with them. Adanna flinched at the harshness of his words. They are my family, she replied softly. I can't just forget them. The river god's eyes flashed with anger. You are mine now, he said, his voice cold. You must learn to accept that. But could she? Adanna wasn't sure if she could ever truly belong to the river, no matter how much power it gave her. One night, as Adanna sat by the pool, she saw a storm brewing over her village. Dark clouds gathered in the sky, and the wind howled through the trees. The river god watched her from the shadows, his gaze unreadable. They will suffer without you, he whispered, his voice like the flow of water. Adanna's heart clenched. She knew he was right. The village needed her, and without her powers, they would struggle. But what could she do? She was trapped beneath the river, bound by the river god's love. Let me go, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Please. The river god remained silent, his gaze fixed on her as the storm raged above. As the storm passed, Adanna saw a vision of her family in the pool. Her mother and father were huddled together in their small hut, their faces etched with worry. Her brothers were out in the fields, trying to save what little crops remained. Adanna's heart ached. She wanted to help them, to bring rain to their fields and ease their suffering. But the river god's love kept her trapped beneath the water. Tears filled her eyes as she watched her family struggle. She had to find a way to return, to use her powers to help them. In her visions, Adanna saw more of the village's struggles. The crops were dying, the water in the wells was drying up, and the people were growing desperate. Without Adanna's presence and her powers, the village was slowly withering away. She couldn't stand by and watch them suffer any longer. She had to find a way to return, even if it meant defying the river god. But how? How could she leave when she was bound to him? The thought of returning to her village consumed Adanna. She could no longer sit by and watch her family and friends suffer. She had seen enough in her visions, and now, with the strength of the power she had gained beneath the river, she knew she could help them. But leaving the river god, defying his possessive love, was a different challenge. One night, Adanna made up her mind. She would ask the river god once more for permission to return to her village, but this time she wouldn't take no for an answer. As she entered the grand hall, the river god's eyes met hers. He seemed to know what was coming, his gaze intense. Why do you look so troubled, Adanna? He asked, though his tone hinted at an underlying darkness. I must return, she said, her voice trembling but firm. I must help my village. The river god's expression darkened, and the water around them rippled with tension. Adanna stood her ground, even as the air around her grew heavy with the river god's presence. His eyes flashed with anger, the calm facade he usually maintained breaking. You would leave me? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. After all I have given you? I don't want to leave you, Adanna replied, her voice soft but steady. But my people are suffering. I can't ignore that. The river god took a step closer, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. You belong to me, Adanna. You cannot simply return to the world above. Adanna's heart raced, but she refused to back down. I belong to the river, but I belong to my people too. Let me return, even if only for a time. The river god's expression hardened, and for a moment Adanna feared he would never let her go. But then, after a long silence, he spoke again, his voice cold. "You may return," he said slowly, "but know this, our bond will remain. You will never truly leave me." The decision had been made. The river god allowed Adanna to return to the surface, but a goodbye between them was anything but sweet. As she prepared to leave the palace, she felt the weight of his gaze on her, filled with both sorrow and anger. "I will come for you," he whispered, his voice wrapping around her like the river's current. "Even when you are among your people, you will still be mine." Adanna looked up at him, her heart heavy. Despite everything, she had grown fond of the river god. His love, though possessive, had its tender moments, and part of her ached to leave him behind. "I will never forget you," she whispered in return. With that, the river god stepped back, watching as Adanna was drawn toward the surface, her body rising through the glowing currents. As Adanna rose through the water, her heart was torn between two worlds. The shimmering palace beneath the river grew smaller and smaller, fading into the depths as the light from the surface grew brighter. She closed her eyes, feeling the warm currents around her, knowing that she was leaving behind something she could never fully escape. The power she had gained, the love she had felt, and the bond she shared with the river god would stay with her forever. When she finally broke the surface, the cool air of the village filled her lungs, and she gasped, feeling the weight of the river fall away. But as she looked around, standing on the familiar shores of the Niger River, she knew her journey was far from over. The village was quiet when Adanna first returned. It had been weeks, months, since she had disappeared into the river, and no one had expected to see her again. The stories always ended the same way. The river god's brides never came back. But Adanna was different. As she walked toward the village, her feet sinking into the soft earth, she saw the villagers slowly gathering, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "Adanna!" her mother's voice called from the crowd, trembling with emotion. Adanna smiled weakly, her heart swelling as she saw her family running toward her. Her mother embraced her tightly, sobbing with joy, while her father stood frozen in place, his eyes filled with tears. "You've returned," her mother whispered, holding her daughter close. "You've come back." Adanna's return spread quickly throughout the village. Soon everyone had gathered to see the girl who had come back from the river, a miracle they called it. The drummers played a joyous rhythm, and the villagers danced and sang, celebrating her return. Adanna felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime. The laughter, the music, the love of her people, it was all so familiar, so comforting. But even in the midst of the celebration, she couldn't shake the feeling of the river god's presence lingering in the back of her mind. She smiled and laughed with the others, but deep down she knew her connection to the river had not been severed. In the days following her return, Adanna settled back into her old life, though it was clear that things had changed. The villagers treated her differently, with awe and respect, as though she was something otherworldly. And in truth, she was. The river had given her power, and though she tried to hide it, her magic would slip through in small moments. When the rain fell during a drought, the villagers whispered of Adanna's gift. When the crops grew strong in dry soil, they knew it was her doing. She had brought something back from the river, something that made her more than human. But even as she lived among them, Adanna felt the river calling to her. The bond with the river god tugged at her, reminding her that she could never fully return to the life she once knew. The powers she had gained beneath the river never fully faded. In times of need, Adanna could still call upon the rain to nourish the fields, or coax the crops to grow with a single touch. The villagers marveled at her abilities, but Adanna kept her distance from their praise. The river god's words echoed in her mind, "You will never truly leave me." And it was true. Even when she was in the village, surrounded by her family, She could feel him, his presence in the air, in the water, always watching, always waiting. One night, as she stood by the river, she whispered into the wind, "Are you there?" The water rippled softly, as if in response. He was always there. At night, Adanna's dreams were filled with images of the river. She would dream of the shimmering palace beneath the water, of the spirits that floated through the halls, and of the river god himself, standing tall and majestic, his eyes filled with longing. In her dreams, he would come to her, his voice soft and soothing. "You are still mine, Adanna," he would whisper, his words like a current pulling her back toward the water. "You will always be mine." And though she woke each morning in her village, safe in her bed, the dreams left her feeling haunted, as though a part of her was still trapped beneath the river. It wasn't long before the river god visited her in the waking world. One misty evening, as Adanna walked by the river's edge, she felt a familiar presence in the air. The mist swirled around her, thick and cool, and from the fog, she saw him, tall and shadowy, his eyes glowing faintly in the fading light. "Adanna," he whispered, his voice carried on the wind. "You cannot escape me." Adanna's heart raced, but she didn't move. She knew this day would come, knew that the river god would find her again. "I am with my people now," she said softly, her voice steady. "This is my home." The river god's figure remained still, his eyes never leaving hers. "But you are still mine." Adanna enjoyed the simplicity of village life, gathering water, working in the fields, and sitting by the fire with her family in the evenings. It felt like a return to normalcy, something she hadn't experienced since her time beneath the river. But even in the quiet moments, she could feel the presence of the river god. His whispers came to her in the night, in the mist that rolled off the river, in the rain that fell gently on the fields. She couldn't escape him, no matter how far she tried to distance herself. One evening, as she sat by the river with her siblings, Adanna closed her eyes and listened to the sound of the water. For the first time since her return, she felt a sense of peace, as though the river was offering her a brief moment of respite from its call. But she knew it wouldn't last. As the days passed, the river god's presence grew stronger. His visits, once subtle and distant, became more frequent. He appeared to her in the mist, in her dreams, and even in the shadows of the village. One evening, as Adanna lay in her bed, she felt the familiar pull of the river god's presence. She opened her eyes to find him standing at the foot of her bed, his dark eyes filled with longing and possessiveness. "You cannot escape me," he whispered, his voice soft but firm. "You are still mine, Adanna." Adanna sat up, her heart racing. "I chose to return to my village," she said, her voice trembling. "This is where I belong." The river god stepped closer, his gaze intense. "You may live among your people, but you will never be free of me. The bond we share cannot be broken." Adanna's heart ached at his words. She had hoped that her return to the village would sever the connection she had with the river god, but it was clear now that his love was unyielding. The villagers began to notice the change in Adanna. They whispered among themselves, wondering if the river god still had a hold on her. Though they were grateful for the rain she brought and the life she restored to the crops, they couldn't help but wonder if her bond with the river god would bring danger to the village. One evening, as Adanna walked through the village, she overheard a group of villagers talking in hushed tones. "She's different," one of them said, his voice low. "The river still has a hold on her." "She's brought rain and life to the fields," another replied. "But what if the river god comes for her again? What if he brings a storm?" Adanna's heart sank. She had tried so hard to reintegrate into the village, to live as she once had, but it seemed that her connection to the river god was something she couldn't escape. Adanna felt as though she was living between two worlds. By day, she worked in the fields, cared for her family, and lived as a villager. But by night, the river god's voice called to her, reminding her that she would never be truly free of him. She longed for the simplicity of her old life, but the power she had gained beneath the river and the bond she shared with the river god made it impossible to return to who she once was. One night, as she sat by the river, Adanna felt the weight of her decision. She had chosen to return to the village, but in doing so, she had bound herself to a life of longing for both the village and the river. The village elder, a wise and respected man, approached Adanna one day as she sat by the river. He had watched her closely since her return, and though he was grateful for the gifts she had brought back with her, he sensed the conflict within her. "You are caught between two worlds, Adanna," he said, his voice gentle. "The river has given you great power, but it has also taken something from you." Adanna looked up at the elder, her heart heavy. "I don't know how to live like this," she admitted. "I love my village, my family, but the river god's love is something I can't escape." The elder nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You must find a way to make peace with both worlds, Adanna. But know this, no matter where you go, the river will always be a part of you." As the months passed, the river god's presence in Adanna's life became more intense. His visits, once fleeting, were now constant. She would see him in the mist that rose from the river, feel his touch in the cool breeze that swept through the village, and hear his voice in the rain that fell on the fields. "You are mine," he would whisper, his voice always present, always lingering. Adanna tried to resist, to focus on her life in the village, but the pull of the river was too strong. She knew that the bond she shared with the river god could never be broken, and with each passing day she felt herself being drawn closer to the water. One night, a violent storm swept through the village. The wind howled, the rain poured in torrents, and the river swelled with power. Adanna stood at the edge of the riverbank, her heart racing as she watched the water rise. Adanna's heart ached with longing, but she stood firm. She had chosen to return to her village, to live among her people, and she wouldn't let the river god take that from her. But even as she stood her ground, she knew that the bond between them was too strong to ignore. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the river god's call remained strong. Adanna felt it in every part of her being. The pull of the river, the longing to return to the water. She knew that she couldn't stay in the village forever. The river god's love was possessive, unyielding, and he would never let her go. As she walked along the riverbank, Adanna felt a sense of dread. She had tried to live in both worlds, but it was becoming clear that she would have to make a choice. That evening, as the sun set over the village, Adanna stood by the river, waiting. She knew the river god would come for her, that he would demand her return to the water. And she was right. The mist rolled in, and from it, the river god appeared, his eyes glowing with intensity. "Adanna," he whispered, his voice soft but commanding. "It's time." Adanna's heart pounded in her chest. She loved her village, her family, but the river god's love was something she couldn't escape. She had to make a choice. "I can't live like this," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't live between two worlds." The river god stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Then come back to me. The river is your true home." Adanna looked out over the water, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. The village was quiet as Adanna made her way to the riverbank. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the water. She stood at the edge of the river, her heart filled with uncertainty. She had lived in the village for months now, trying to find peace in the life she once knew. But the pull of the river, the love of the river god, was always there, lingering in the background. Adanna closed her eyes, feeling the cool breeze brush against her skin. She knew that no matter what choice she made, the river god would never truly leave her. As the mist swirled around her, Adanna felt the presence of the river god once again. His figure emerged from the fog, tall and majestic, his eyes filled with longing. "You know what you must do, Adanna," he whispered, his voice like the flow of the river. Adanna's heart ached. She had tried to live in both worlds, but it was becoming clear that she couldn't continue like this. "I love my people," she said softly, "but I can't deny the bond we share." The river god stepped closer, his gaze intense. "Then come back to me." Adanna stood in silence, torn between the love she had for her village and the unbreakable bond she shared with the river god. In the end, Adanna knew what she had to do. The bond between her and the river god was too strong, too deep to sever. She had tried to live in her village, to return to the life she once knew, but she couldn't escape the river's call. The water had claimed her, and with it, the love of the river god that pulsed through her veins. With a heavy heart, Adanna took a step forward, her feet sinking into the soft mud at the edge of the riverbank. The mist swirled around her, thick and cool as the river god waited in the shadows. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the water lapping against the shore. The river god stepped forward, his eyes glowing faintly in the mist. "You will always be mine, Adanna," he said, his voice soft but filled with power. "You belong to the river." Adanna closed her eyes, feeling the pull of the water as it wrapped around her legs, pulling her gently toward the depths. The river god's hand reached out, brushing her cheek as he guided her back to the world beneath the water. And as she descended into the river's embrace, she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. She had made her choice. She had returned to the river, where she would remain forever, by the side of the river god. Though Adanna had returned to the river, her heart would always carry the memory of the village, of her family, and the life she had once known. She had made the choice to live beneath the water, but she would never forget the world above. And sometimes, on quiet nights, the villagers would say they could see her, Adanna, standing at the edge of the river, her figure silhouetted against the moonlight. They said she looked the same as when she had left, her long braids flowing in the wind, her eyes filled with longing. The villagers spoke of her with reverence, remembering the girl who had returned from the river, the one who had brought rain to their fields and life to their crops. But they also spoke of the river god, the being who had claimed her, who would never let her go. For though Adanna had returned to the river, the bond between her and the river god remained unbroken. His love, like the current of the river, flowed through her veins, binding her to him forever. And though she lived beneath the water, in the shimmering palace of the river god, her heart would always long for the world above. For her family, her village, her people. She could never be truly free of them, just as she could never be free of the river god's love. In the end, Adanna had found her place between two worlds. She was the river god's bride, bound to the water for eternity. But in her heart, she was still a daughter of the village, a girl who had once lived beneath the sun among the people she loved.